forward in our efforts to ensure that Ireland's framework for tackling organised crime is robust and effective. Cathaoirleach, you'll recall that 29 years ago last month, the very brave journalist Veronica Guerin was murdered. In the aftermath of her murder, there were very significant legislative changes made by the houses of the Oireachtas to ensure that we could combat the organised crime gangs that had such violence and influence at that time. It's apparently the case, and it still is the case, regrettably, that those crime gangs in different guises continue to exist. We can also see throughout our communities the damage and devastation that organised drug crime gangs heap on society. We see it in terms of the damage done to young people who become addicted to drugs which have been dealt to them because of the greed of those organised crime gangs. Obviously, the motivator for all these organised crime gangs when it comes to the dealing of drugs is money. They get involved in organised crime and in the dealing of drugs because they want to make money from this pursuit. So let us never lose sight of the fact that what motivates them is where we should continue to hit them. Even yesterday, Cathaoirleach, we would have seen that a very significant drug dealer pleaded guilty to very serious offences before the Central Criminal Court or Circuit Criminal Court in respect of the type of drug activity that he was involved in terms of being a multi-million euro cocaine dealer, cannabis dealer and ketamine dealer. Just at the outset, by the way, Cathaoirleach, I want to commend Garda Síochána for the excellent work that they did in apprehending that serious criminal and bringing him to trial and getting a conviction arising from his own admission of guilt. I want to commend the Dublin Crime Response Team. I want to commend Assistant Commissioner Paul Cleary and Detective Inspector Ken Holan for the excellent work that the Dublin Crime Response Team did yesterday in apprehending what was a significant drug dealer in this country. Of course, we need to keep at the forefront of our mind that we need to keep updating and changing our laws to ensure that we can remain on top of these organised crime gangs so that we never get them in a situation where they feel comfortable about their accumulation of wealth. As I stated at the outset, the legislation that was introduced in the aftermath of Veronica Guerin's murder was revolutionary legislation. I went back and had a look at the legislation itself that was introduced in the summer of 1996. It was, interestingly, a private member's bill in its first incarnation through the then opposition spokesperson for Fianna Fáil, John O'Donoghue. In fairness to the government of the day, they subsequently adopted through Minister for Justice Nora Owen, but it has had a very significant impact on the activities of criminals operating in Ireland. When I get the opportunity, as I haven't had in the past, to meet Justice Ministers and Home Affairs Ministers from other European countries, one of the things that they wish to talk about is the proceeds of crime legislation that was introduced in Ireland and that has been operating now for 30 years. What fascinates them and interests them is the fact that we have a system whereby you can have a non-criminal conviction process of attaching assets that have been generated by criminals. That was the great achievement of the Proceeds of Crime Act of 1996 and indeed the corresponding Criminal Assets Bureau legislation which was enacted in the same year. And I just want to commend the excellent work done by the Criminal Assets Bureau and in particular Detective Chief Superintendent Michael Gubbins, who's the head of CAB, for the very important work that they do on an ongoing basis. The legislation that's before the House this afternoon, Cathaoirleach, is for the purpose of amending the Proceeds of Crime legislation and to ensure that it is more effective in seeking to pursue organised crime gangs who have made a lot of money out of criminal activity. Those proceeds of crime should not be permitted to remain with them. If we have difficulties in getting criminal convictions before the courts, we should still nonetheless use the civil courts and the proceeds of crime legislation to ensure that we can seize their assets. That has been done very effectively in the past. If you look at the success of the Criminal Assets Bureau, you'll see it has denied criminals over 220 million since its establishment, and that's a testament to its success and the importance of introducing that new statutory body. The impact of organised crime extends far beyond financial loss, as I said, Cahirlic. It inflicts profound social harm and erodes the fabric of our communities. Everyone in this House will be aware of the devastation that drug addiction has on young people. It destroys their lives. We really need to repeat that consistently so that people are aware if they start experimenting with drugs, there's a serious threat that this will have a devastating impact on their lives. The people who are pushing drugs to them are doing it for one reason and one reason only. They want to make money so they can use that wealth for their own private enjoyment. I can assure you they'll never allow themselves to become addicted in the same way as their victims have become addicted. The wealth generated by criminal conduct is often flaunted, creating a corrosive culture where law-abiding citizens feel that the system is failing, while criminals appear to operate beyond the reach of the law. As established in the Proceeds of Crime Act 1996, the state's objective is to deprive or to deny those persons of the assets or the benefit of such assets. This is crucial for restoring public confidence and demonstrating that the state is committed to justice and fairness. By removing the symbols of their power, we undermine the influence of criminals and protect communities from intimidation and exploitation. Ireland's existing laws, particularly the 1996 Proceeds of Crime Act and indeed the Criminal Assets Bureau Act from 1996, have established, as I said, an internationally recognised and internationally influential model for seizing illicit assets. The Proceeds of Crime model is built on two foundational elements. The first is a system of civil forfeiture that, rather than prosecuting offences and then trying to trace the proceeds of those crimes, starts from the assets and builds the case that those assets have an unlawful origin. The second is that a specialised agency, CAB, brings together Gardaí, the Revenue Commissioners and Social Protection Officers, along with other specialist staff, to link their intelligence and investigations, allowing them to target sophisticated and profit-driven criminality. These building blocks have undoubtedly been effective and successful, and as I said, since its inception, CAB has seized and returned over €220 million to the Exchequer. However, as crime and the methods criminals use to hide their wealth continue to evolve, so must our response. And this bill introduces crucial updates to confront those modern challenges, enabling faster and more efficient seizure of criminal assets, whether they're gained from drug trafficking or other forms of organised crime. Two central reforms ensure that when the evidence is there of the illicit origin of assets, the state will move quickly to ensure that those in possession of them cannot continue to benefit. The first is the reduction of the time required to permanently seize assets. Under the current law, once the High Court has determined an asset is derived from crime, the state must wait 7 years before taking final ownership. This bill reduces that period to 2 years, a change designed to prevent criminals from continuing to enjoy the benefits of their illicitly gained assets long after they've been frozen by the courts. The second is that once a court has determined that assets are the proceeds of crime, then a receiver will be appointed to those assets specifically for the purpose of depriving those holding them of their benefit. Furthermore, the bill introduces new tools to freeze funds reasonably suspected of being the proceeds of crime at the earliest stages of an investigation. These are designed specifically for CAB and reflect the complexity of their investigations. A new administrative payment freezing direction can be issued by a senior bureau officer for up to 7 days, while a payment freezing order may be made by the district court for a period of up to 90 days and may be renewed by the court for as long as it's necessary and proportionate to do so. This allows CAB to act immediately on intelligence, preventing money from being moved or dissipated while a full investigation is underway. I'm acutely aware of the importance of balancing these enhanced powers with the protection of fundamental rights, and I want to provide reassurance on this point. It's crucial to emphasise that this bill is built upon a foundation of robust judicial oversight. The new powers for asset detention and the freezing of accounts are supervised by the District Court, while the more significant powers of appointing a receiver and ordering the final forfeiture of assets remain reserved for the High Court. At every stage, a judge must be satisfied that the actions taken are reasonable, necessary and proportionate. Ultimately, these changes will pave the way for a more efficient and effective asset seizure process. The state will be better equipped to quickly deprive criminals of their wealth, disrupt their operations and return those funds to the Exchequer for the benefit of all citizens. CAB's successes are actively reflected in the reinvestment of the proceeds of crime into the community. The Community Safety Fund is a tangible example of how this works in practice, ensuring that money taken from criminal networks is reinvested in local projects that improve safety, well-being and opportunity. This year, €4 million is available through the fund, double the original allocation from its first year, demonstrating our commitment to returning these resources to the public and allowing communities to benefit directly from our success in tackling organised crime. The bill before us today is comprised of 17 sections across 3 parts, and I just want to take you briefly through those different parts and sections. Part 1 of the bill comprises sections 1 and 2 and contains the standard preliminary provisions. Part 2 of the bill amends the Proceeds of Crime Act 1996. Section 1A of the 1996 Act allows the seizure by a CAB officer of movable property for an initial 24-hour period. This may be extended by the Chief Bureau Officer for a further 21-day period. Section 4 of the bill will amend this provision to allow an application to the District Court to be made thereafter for further extensions, up to a maximum of 90 days in aggregate with appropriate safeguards. Section 5 creates a power to freeze financial accounts. A senior bureau officer can issue a 7-day administrative freeze on an account where that is necessary to conduct preliminary investigations. The District Court may make a similar order for a period of up to 90 days where it's satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the funds in the account of the proceeds of crime, that there is a risk of the dissipation of those funds and that freezing is necessary and proportionate. Again, appropriate safeguards are in place and provision is made for the order to be challenged and to be revoked or varied as necessary. Section 8 of the bill cuts the waiting time for the final seizure of criminal assets from 7 years down to just 2, as I indicated earlier on. This reform sends a clear message. Once the court has decided your assets are derived from crime, you will lose them, and you will lose them quickly. Furthermore, to bring finality and efficiency to the process, this section introduced measures to ensure that issues which have already been litigated when a Section 3 order is made are not re-argued. And that is something that has happened frequently in the past, where you've had a situation when the freezing application is being made, arguments in respect to the fact that the assets aren't the proceeds of crime, and then subsequently, a number of years later, the issue is re-litigated when it comes to the permanent seizure of the assets. There is no necessity that we have that re-litigation, and it's noteworthy that there was a Supreme Court decision yesterday which partially dealt with that issue and saw no issue in respect of it. Crucially, however, the necessity to hear all parties is protected, as is the Court's power to avoid a serious risk of injustice. Section 9 is a consequential amendment that supports this new, more robust approach to the final seizure of assets. It provides flexibility by removing the time limit on consent disposal orders. This allows CAB and a respondent to agree to the forfeiture of an asset at any stage, again avoiding needless litigation. Section 11 strengthens the powers of receivership. It creates a presumption in favour of the immediate appointment of a receiver once an interlocutory order is made. The receiver's purpose is now explicitly stated as being, quote, to deprive the respondent of the ongoing benefit and use of the property, unquote. This ensures that immediate possession of assets may be secured and that the incentive to frustrate the process is removed. Again, this power is subject to avoidance of a serious risk of injustice. Finally, within Part 2, there are a number of more technical and consequential amendments to align definitions and procedures with the more substantial changes introduced elsewhere in the bill. Part 3 addresses other acts to ensure that the framework is aligned and effective. Section 15 harmonises the definition of cash in Section 43 of the Criminal Justice Act 1994 with Regulation 2018-1672, which is the EU cash control regulation. It also makes a practical change to the rules about placing seized assets in an interest-bearing account. Section 16 enhances the operational capacity of the Bureau. Firstly, it allows non-Garda experts in the Bureau, tax inspectors and social welfare officers to sit in on interviews of detained persons for a wider range of serious offences. This brings their vital expertise right into the interview room. Secondly, it extends the anonymity protections for CAB officers to cover them even after they have left the Bureau. That is something that is essential, and again I just want to commend the diligence and bravery of CAB officers who sometimes are involved in potentially dangerous work. The threats that these officers may face do not stop on their leaving CAB. Finally, Section 17 is a technical provision that, to ensure anti-corruption laws are aligned with the changes we are making here. Let us be clear about what these measures will achieve. The bill is not just about legal processes or receiverships, it's about delivering real-world impact by ensuring the benefits of a criminal lifestyle are not just delayed but denied. By cutting the waiting period for final seizures from 7 years to 2 years, and by empowering receivers to take immediate control of assets, we're sending a clear message. The message is that the proceeds of crime will be swiftly and completely removed from those who have wronged our society. We've seen that already, the success of it at Cathaoirleach, in terms of large organised crime gangs that were based in Ireland. They left because of the pressure from Garda Síochána, because they were being brought before the courts, and indeed because of the powers available to CAB. Additionally, this bill is not merely about taking from criminals, it's also about giving back to our communities who have been targeted by criminals. The funds seized through this enhanced process will be returned to the Exchequer and reinvested for the public good, with the Community Safety Fund being a powerful example of how money taken from organised crime is channelled directly into local projects that enhance safety and well-being across the country. There are a number of matters that I intend to return to at committee stage, Cathaoirleach, and I'll flag the most notable of these for the information of the House now and so that colleagues are aware. The first concerns information exchange with independent domestic statutory agencies, such as the Director of Public Prosecutions. Consultation is continuing on this data protection aspects of this matter, and I expect to introduce a provision allowing for a designation of appropriate bodies to receive relevant information from CAB. I also expect to introduce a provision in respect to the publication of tax defaulter information in relation to CAB settlements. I'm also considering further expansion of the assets held in accounts which may fall under the restraint provisions introduced in Section 5. There are several further, more technical provisions that I won't go into here now, but they are also under consideration. Many of the details will merit debate, and I look forward to working constructively with members as the bill progresses. We'll have an opportunity again at committee stage to look at a number of matters in terms of what the bill does or does not cover. And I know there's general acceptance across the House about the success of the Proceeds of Crime legislation and the Criminal Assets Bureau legislation as they've operated in the country for the past 30 years. It's a significant and important development. It means that even if we can't get criminal convictions against criminals who are destroying our communities, we can bring them before the civil courts and we can seize the assets that they have secured through their criminal activity. Those proceeds of crime should be taken off them. They should be invested in the communities they're trying to destroy, and I think everyone in this House will agree that's a commendable purpose, and that's why I commend this legislation to the House.
Deputy Mark Ward.
Minister, I just want to join you in commending the work of CAB over the years in seizing assets from organised crime gangs, and also in relation to the comments that you made in relation to Garda Síochána and taking drugs off our streets, which is really needed. Sinn Féin does support this bill, the aims of this bill, Minister. However, as you mentioned, there will be a committee stage and we may seek to put amendments to further strengthen this bill at that stage, and I'll speak to some of these in my contribution as I go on. Reducing the time it takes between seizing and disposal of criminal assets is a good thing. It's a no-brainer, to be honest. A reduction from 7 years to 2 years in the time between an order being made, the assets are the proceeds of crime, and the final disposal order being available in respect of those assets probably should have been done a long time ago. We've seen how criminals have tied up the legal system in knots as CAB tries to take back assets that are ill-gotten, assets that are the proceeds of crime. And it's important, as you said yourself, Minister, that these assets are returned back into communities. It is also welcome that it will be made easier to freeze funds associated with criminal activity. We should aim, as a state, to make it difficult as possible for organised crime gangs to operate, not only within our communities, but also, Minister, at a business level. The practice of criminals investing in legitimate business to wash their dirty money is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's going on since time began. We cannot be soft on white-collar crime or dodgy business owners who facilitate this. White-collar criminals should not be allowed to operate under a shroud of acceptability. There is a direct connection between the visible crimes that we see daily and criminals laundering money. Proceeds from street muggings, from car break-ins to burglaries and other daily occurrences on our streets are filtered through these fronts. Just because these white-collar criminals do not have dirt under their fingernails doesn't mean that their hands are clean. CAB should have the powers to tackle international and cybercrime. Money laundering, cybercrime, counterfeiting and fraud are the tools used by these white-collar criminals. Mixing with the so-called upper echelons of society, displaying the trappings of their ill-gotten gains through fancy homes, fancy cars and golf club memberships give these white-collar criminals an air of respectability that they do not deserve. They walk around in their flash suits looking down on people in tracksuits. The dirty money gets moved from place to place, from one place to another, and comes up clean on the other side. So we need to give CAB and An Gardaí the powers to stop this happening. Minister, in the PLS, the Justice Committee report recommended that an examination take place regarding the current criteria and eligibility for potential projects under the Community Safety Innovation Fund. Sinn Féin has long advocated for the reinvestment of the proceeds of crime back into communities that are most affected by crimes. In fact, my party colleague Ainsley Snuddy first raised this over 15 years ago. In 2021, myself and Deputy Rory O'Murrough introduced the Proceeds of Crime Investment in Disadvantaged Communities Bill. This would see the proceeds of crime reinvested into communities to build resilience through our drugs task forces, family resource centres, youth diversion projects, unemployment services, sports clubs and anybody that's involved in working in disadvantaged areas. In response to this, the Government, in fairness, established the Community Safety Fund, to which local groups can make applications for grants. But, however, Minister, this application process can be arduous, and the most affected communities do not always receive approval for funding. The fund has risen from 2 million in 22 to 4 million this year. Grants range from 20,000 to 150,000, depending on the project, and we welcome the increase in this funding. But we have to see the money directed to the communities who are most in need of this. Funding allocations, and we believe that funding allocations should be linked to the Pobal Index. Parts of my community, according to the Pobal Index, are extremely disadvantaged or very disadvantaged. So I'm going to give an example. In 2022, there were 22 successful applications for the Community Safety Fund. From my own area, from the areas that are highly disadvantaged and very disadvantaged, 6 organisations applied. Not one of these were successful, Minister. So this tells me that not all the money allocated to this fund is going to the areas that are most affected by crime. And this is something that I want to see change, Minister. Sinn Féin would also like to see the establishment of a mini-CAB which would target low-level criminals. A mini-criminal assets bureau should be established in areas worst affected by low to mid-level criminals, particularly those in the drug trades. Drug debt intimidation of families is rife in working class areas. I've been calling for a local mini-CAB to take the local so-called big boys out of circulation. While locally they may be the big fish in the small pond, overall they are small fry. These low-level players may not be asset rich, Minister, but they have an asset. They have a lifestyle that is actually rich. They have the expensive clothes, the foreign holidays, the trips to the sporting events. Their lifestyles simply do not match their means, and it's all played out on social media for the world to see. A mini-CAB would target these lifestyle-rich criminals. It would seek to break the attractive lifestyle of criminals that is often used to coerce young people into criminal activity. The young people in my area do not see the leaders of organised crime on a daily basis, as they are far removed from the daily grind of on-street drug dealing, but they do see the local players, and their lifestyle is what attracts them into criminality. We need to support the most disadvantaged areas in building resilience to crime. These low-level players are often the drivers of drug debt intimidation. I've met parents in my own area who are forced to pay drug-related debts that their children have accumulated. These debts that the children apparently owe these unscrupulous dealers are frequently exaggerated to the parents, who end up paying exorbitant amounts back to these dealers for fear of reprisals. The money that the mother borrowed from the credit union to pay the drug debts of her child flows right from the low-level drug dealer right up to the upper echelons of the organised crime gangs. Young people engaged in criminality, Minister, should face the appropriate justice. In case of minor offences, though, they should be diverted as much as possible away from the judicial system. And I stress, in the case of minor offences, youth diversion projects and programmes need to meet the hard-to-reach young people, those that are most at risk of getting involved in crime, those that are not involved in school, in youth clubs and other community groups. These are the young people that have fallen through the cracks of society. Youth diversion projects should be agile enough to meet them on the streets where the criminality and the antisocial behaviour is taking place. Targeted outreach should be used to persuade and help those young people to make better choices and lead them away from a life of crime. And I know you went out and met Sullus there recently yourself, Minister, which is welcome. Organisations like that, if that was expanded into other areas of Dublin and right across the state, I think it would be a really welcome initiative. These are the very young people who are being targeted by older, experienced drug dealers to sell and deliver drugs. Children are being groomed by unscrupulous drug dealers, and this, Minister, is child abuse. The children are attracted by the flashy cars, the new runners and the few quids in their pocket. The status of being called a so-called somebody, and these criminals are actually nobodies. They suck the lifebloods out of our communities and they return very little. Actually, they return nothing but devastation. We need to be proactive rather than reactive and target these young people with appropriate diversionary services before they end up in the hands of drug dealers. Government also needs to be careful of who they do business with and to make sure government funds are not ending up in the pockets of organised criminals. Reports over the weekend said that the government had paid millions for iPass accommodation to a company owned by a man currently awaiting sentence for violent disorder. A man named by the Criminal Assets Bureau as being linked to the drought of the gang feud were deeply worrying. This must be a wake-up call for government and the need for a full investigation into the granting of contracts and profiteering in the provision of iPass accommodation. It just goes to show the level of money involved in providing iPass accommodation if people named by CAB are getting involved. And I suggest also, Minister, that the money seized by CAB is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much dirty money still in the hands of criminals. In Ireland, the value of crime markets is calculated at 1.7 billion per annum, which is slightly higher than 1% of the Irish GDP. You mentioned there at the start of your contribution, CAB has seized 220 million since its inception, which is really welcome, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. The government bill today is a step in the right direction to help seize assets, but it's obvious there's more needs to be done. Again, I want to reiterate my point that any money seized by CAB is returned to the areas that originated from. Extremely disadvantaged areas need the support to stop the next generation of young people becoming involved in a life of crime. Minister, recommendation 15 of the Justice Committee report states that the committee recommends further examination of the use of funds recovered from the proceeds of crime and how such funds could be invested through the provision of preventative supports within communities. This is an area that the government must prioritise in relation to any changes in relation to legislation in CAB.
Cavan, who are the guests of Minister Niamh Smith. Deputy.
No bother, thank you, Chairperson. Minister, before I start, I just want to welcome and thank CAB for the work they've done over the last number of years, and I really want to talk about the Community Safety Fund later on in my contribution and how that can be enhanced. Firstly, the aims of the bill are very positive, aims that my party and myself support. Any efforts that attempt to deny criminals their ill-gotten gains is very welcome, and the message must be delivered loud and clear that crime doesn't pay, and we have to make that a reality. In my home city of Limerick, we have a number of ongoing feuds between criminals and criminal gangs, and it's almost inevitable that lives will be lost, and I've said that in this chamber a number of occasions before. Often these criminal feuds are between drug dealers and their associated feuds, fueled by desire to increase their share of the market. Some of the areas impacted are often areas of huge deprivation. Organised crime flourishes in areas that have been abandoned by central government. This is as true as parts of Limerick as it is in parts of inner city Dublin. The vast majority of people in these communities have retired or are hard-working people and just want to do the right thing. They want to make a positive impact on their own local communities. But the criminal elements there who seek an illegally gained quick profit, often on the misery of others, do massive damage, and we have destroyed many people. They flaunt illegally gained wealth, and this wealth can attract vulnerable youths into their criminal grip. Taking their ill-gotten wealth away from these anti-community elements is crucial. It demonstrates that crime doesn't pay and that their success, in want of a better word, will only ever be fleeting, and that the state, often for the first time, will have the backs of decent people in many of these areas. It is immensely satisfying to see this wealth return to communities through the Community Safety Fund. Such an approach is one that Sinn Féin have advocated for years, and my colleagues who sit beside me here at the moment, Mark Ward and Rory O'Murchu, introduced the Proceeds of Crime Investment in Disadvantaged Communities Amendment Bill in 2021. To date, in its 4-year operation, the Community Safety Fund has returned $7.6 million back into communities, and that is very, very welcome. We should be putting more back into communities mostly impacted by crime. There are elements of the fund that we would like to see altered, namely the arduous application process that often the fund and sees is not awarded to the communities most in need. To this end, Minister, we would like to see the funding allocation linked to the Public Deprivation Index. And just to comment on that one here, there is no area in the state more deprived than St Mary's Park area of my city of Limerick. And there's more, and I'm open to correction, but there is no area more impacted by the crack cocaine and antisocial behaviour, criminality, and absolute organised crime gangs that have devastated that area for the last number of years. So I would hope that the people in St Mary's Park, community, the groups, the brilliant groups that are there, don't have to go through an arduous process. But you'd actually ring them up at a community safety group, would ring up a number of those areas and give them the funding. We all know exactly what they need. Limerick and our areas have had a massive problem with crack cocaine. At the same time, as I said, we have fantastic local community projects in Limerick, and they do some fantastic work with limited resources. So I would like to see the grant amount available through the Community Safety Fund increase dramatically. However, we also have many groups and projects, as I said, doing incredible work, trying to break the cycle of imprisonment and crime. They could do so much more with increased resources. And Minister, this would save us money in the long term. We would keep young people out of prison. We welcome this bill and we look forward to seeing its impact on those who do so much damage to our communities. As I've said, more must be done to support the vast majority of families who are hard-working, law-abiding and just want to raise their children and get on with their lives. It does not happen by accident, and most of the money seized by CAB originate in areas that are highly disadvantaged. We need to see a stronger approach by the government. I'm calling for them to ring-fence the money seized by CAB and to ensure it's invested back into areas most affected by crime. Just to reference the bill itself, the Criminal Assets Bureau, since its inception in 1996, has worked well, and their seizures of assets and wealth has had a devastating effect on criminals, but a joy for many local residents to see. The bill that we discussed today will strengthen the Criminal Assets Bureau. These new provisions will deprive criminals of illegally obtained assets that should have been returned to the communities most affected, and while this has started to be done, it needs to be speeded up. Section 8 of the bill seeks to amend Section 4 of the Proceeds of Crime Act, so there's time period between an order being made that assets or the proceeds of crime and a disposal order is reduced from 7 years to 2 years. And this is a very welcome amendment that ensures that assets such as houses can be returned to the community quickly. The immediate appointment of a receiver to assets is also extremely welcome. Once in place, this will ensure that the suspect of crime is deprived of any benefit from these assets. Furthermore, the restriction of freezing of financial accounts and the detention of movable assets in a timely manner will ensure that the gangs and their associates are very much restricted in the use of these assets, and that's very, very welcome. As I've said, the Criminal Assets Bureau has been a fantastic resource to target criminals, and it's pleasing to see their powers going to be increased. CAB are there to pounce on the proceeds of crime, but we must, as a state, must do more to stop criminal behaviour in its inception. It is a role that the Community Guard has performed well over the last number of years. Unfortunately, we have seen their numbers slashed. We need to see these Gardaes return to areas of deprivation, return to urban estates. We need these communities to see the Gardaí in a positive light, and not just see Gardaí when they're undertaking raids, etc. We must also ensure that the bond between community and Gardaí remains unbroken, and increasing the community Garda numbers is a key in that link of the chain. So we also need to ensure that we focus on the little, I'm not sure what word I'll describe them as, but the little criminals who drive around, donning expensive watches, driving high-powered vehicles, often holidays all over social media, while not seeming to explain how they earn any of that or ever worked at all. So to conclude, I very much welcome today's debate and the aims of the legislation, but this cannot happen in isolation. We must reinvest in these communities. We must the state must re-engage with these communities so that we can limit the allure of the criminal lifestyle. So, as I said, welcome this enhanced powers for the Criminal Justice Bureau very much.
Thank you very much. Deputy Alan Kelly, please.
Thank you, Cahill. Minister, this is very good legislation, and you should be commended for it, and we will be supporting it 100%. I also want to compliment CAB, the officers, the people who work there, working very sensitive and dangerous work. And anonymity is important going forward because these criminals and their organisations have I suppose, long views. So I think it's incredibly important we protect the people who work for CAB. I just want to acknowledge something that shows how politics at times works. CAB came into existence because of Rory Quinn. Rory Quinn, former Labour Minister, working with Nora Owen on a suggestion from John O'Donoghue. That's how CAB came into existence. So it shows government and opposition working together can deliver when they work in a collaborative way. I always remember there was a documentary on about CAB, I'm not sure which station it was on, could have been TV3 at the time, where Rory Quinn was interviewed, where he asked, or he and Nora Owen spoke to officials about the creation of CAB, and they said they would deliberate and come back to them on whether they thought this was a good idea. To which he supposedly quoted, "You haven't," and I won't use the F word, listen to what we said. We are going to do this and we're going to make it happen. And they did make it happen. And it has been incredibly successful. So much so that in many other jurisdictions, they look at what we do here in Ireland. That we have the capacity in a modern, liberal society to still have legislation like this that works. So the changes that are being brought around by this legislation are very welcome. In fact, to be honest about it, it probably should have happened beforehand. Dropping the length of time here is from 7 to 2 years is completely and utterly a good idea. The way in which this legislation helps to freeze funds quicker is also a good idea, because the people that CAB are targeting and the people that we support them targeting have the capacity to frustrate through the legal system. And this diminishes that considerably, which is excellent, and I believe will really help as regards the work that CAB does. So we will be supporting this legislation, but I just want to make 2 brief points. My colleague Brendan Howlin in 2020 also brought in some legislation that from opposition, but it got as far as second stage. The Proceeds of Crime, Gross Human Rights Abuses Act. And it was to give powers, it was based on the Maginski Act, it was to give CAB powers for any organisation that is operating in a way where they are involved in any form of human rights abuses outside the state, but they have assets in this state that CAB can seize them to. Now, I think, Minister, this is something, while more complex to legislate for, it is certainly something we should be coming back to, and something that we may put amendments down in order to achieve. Purely, if not at this juncture, to get it legislated for, because I accept it would be a complex piece of legislation, but to have a discussion on it as regards what is required to do so. Because I think anybody in this state would support CAB having those powers. When some organisation or people or persons are operating in a way which is diminishing human rights abuses, but have assets in our country that they can be seized as well. There will obviously have to be wording on a formula, a methodology, and the technical details of how to do that. But I believe it is something that we should seriously contemplate. And the last issue I want to raise is in relation to how we use the funds that are seized, and the assets that are seized and then sold. I think the whole issue in relation to the Community Safety Fund, I think the whole way in which it's run is a little bit too complex and arduous, to be honest. I think the process by which applications come through, I think there should be categorisations in it, under which various different groups should be able to apply. Obviously, we can index it in relation to areas that are more deprived or areas that have more crime. But I also think that whether it's rural or urban areas shouldn't matter, because rural crime, there are certain requirements as regards CCTV or other technologies or other mechanisms that would probably not exist in a rural area which needs funding and community groups will be able to apply for. There has always been, though, Minister, I know because I brought in one of the initial community schemes when it came to CCTV on motorways. And I think it took 8 years to sort out data protection issues about who was the holder of data. It was insane. Bananas. Ridiculous. They had the funds. Like, this is all about high-powered motor vehicles going up and down the motorway and communities wanting to be able to monitor who was coming in and out of their communities off those motorways. It took years. Nobody would own the data. So in whatever provisions we can, maybe we could deal with that issue as well, because I think everywhere now, given the fact that there is so much monitoring, that from a legislative point of view we should be able to deal with that a lot easier, so that technologies like that can be put into places that need them a lot easier than what has been in the past. But I commend this legislation and I compliment the Minister and his staff. It's an excellent piece of legislation which I think everybody in this House should support. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Cormac.
Okay, here, look, and just before I begin, I just want to thank you and indeed Ceann Corda's office and all the ushers and all the staff here in the Oireachtas for all their assistance to all the members over the last number of months and during this term. I'd like to speak about the Proceeds of Crime and Related Matters Bill 2025, which is a vital piece of legislation that strengthens our national ability to disrupt, dismantle and defeat serious organised crime. Let us begin with the facts. The scale of the criminal profit is staggering. Across the European Union, it's estimated that criminal revenues reach €110 billion annually, equivalent of 1% of EU GDP. Here in Ireland, criminal activity is estimated to generate €1.7 billion per annum. That's not just numbers on a page, that's money made from the sale of illegal drugs, human trafficking, online fraud, coercive control, money that funds intimidation, corruption and violence. Organised crime is not abstract. It preys on the most vulnerable in our communities and its engine is money. The clear message from this bill, though, is we will take that engine away. Ireland's existing framework for seizing the proceeds of crime is already regarded as internationally a model of best practice. The Proceeds of Crime Act 1996, along with the Criminal Assets Bureau Act of 1996, both introduced in response to the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin, pioneered a civil, non-conviction based approach to asset seizure. Since then, the powers have been enhanced, both in 2005 and in 2016. But crime evolves and so must we. This bill delivers a modernisation of our laws in line with expert reviews, the views of stakeholders and best international practice. And let me highlight some of those key reforms. First, and perhaps most significantly, this bill reduces the period before a final disposal order can be made from 7 years to just 2. That's a game changer. It means that once the courts have determined the assets are the proceeds of crime, the state can act far quicker to strip criminals of those assets, whether they be cash, vehicles, property or other assets. Justice delayed is justice denied, and this will end unnecessary delays in disrupting criminal finances. Secondly, once such a determination is made, the bill allows for the immediate and automatic appointment of a receiver, preventing any further benefits from those assets pending final disposal. So no more limbo, no more criminals living off the illicit wealth while proceeds drag on. And then the third, The bill itself prevents the same legal arguments being re-litigated again and again and again. If the courts have already found assets to be criminal in origin, that conclusion cannot be reopened every time a disposal order is made. That adds certainty and avoids delays, while still preserving the right of appeal and review where appropriate. And fourth, it enhances the Gardaí and indeed CAB's tools at the investigation stage. For the first time, this bill introduces new powers for restraint of funds in financial accounts. That means a CAB superintendent can direct a bank to freeze suspect funds for 7 days, and the courts can extend that for up to 90 days. This plugs a key gap in our law and ensures that suspected dirty money cannot simply vanish overnight while investigations are ongoing. These are powerful, proportionate and well-designed reforms that reflect the professionalism and the experience of the Criminal Assets Bureau, which has been central to the drafting of this legislation. It is also important to note that this bill protects the rights of individuals. Judicial oversight remains central to the process, and there are safeguards in place to prevent injustice, but equally, it ends a situation where delay and procedural complexity can be used as tools by criminal organisations to retain the illicit wealth. Beyond these legal changes, we will continue to support the wider use of the proceeds of crime for community good, such as the Community Safety Fund, now in its 4th year with a €4 million budget for 2025. And it's a clear example of how we can take the money once used to fuel misery and instead use it to build safer, stronger communities. Projects tackling youth crime, drug intimidation, domestic violence, antisocial behaviour are all supported under this fund. This is justice in action. And finally, I want to acknowledge the Programme for Government commitment to expand the powers of the Criminal Assets Bureau and increase transparency, including the power to publish tax defaulters lists. These are further steps I hope can be advanced during the coming stages of this bill. Cathaoirleach, this legislation sends a strong and unequivocal message. Ireland will not be a safe haven for criminal wealth. We will find it, we will freeze it, and we will take it through the due process and rule of law. In doing so, we hit criminal organisations where it hurts, their finances, and I commend Minister Jim O'Callaghan, his officials, and indeed the Criminal Assets Bureau for their work on this groundbreaking piece of legislation to tackle serious crime. This can't come soon enough, but I take from the Minister's own experience and his own legal background, this has meant that this has enriched the legislation which we have today, and I hope all members of the House will support it. Gurmagat.
Proceeding to Deputy Barry Ward, I would like to just welcome the Norwegian Ambassador Aslak Brunn to the Chamber. You're very welcome, Ambassador. Deputy Barry Ward.
Gurmagat Cathaoirleach, Gníomhaigh, and I'd like to share your sentiments in relation to the Norwegian Ambassador. You're very welcome. Minister, firstly, I welcome this legislation. This was brought to Cabinet by my colleague Helen McEntee in January of last year, I think, and has progressed since then. And I think it's a very welcome development of the law in relation to the seizure of criminal assets. Can I start by making a point in relation to the drafting of the bill, which you and certainly your officials have heard me make before, in relation to the way that it's presented. In any amending piece of legislation, there is a series of amendments, in this case to the Principal Act being the Proceeds of Crime Act 1996, which are very difficult to understand without reference to the Principal Act itself. And so in order to read this bill and see what it means, you have to have the other one open in front of you. And it does amend other legislative instruments, so reference will have to be had to them as well. I make the point time and time again that when we're amending legislation, so legislation that's amending an existing act, I think it's more appropriate to take the section that's being amended, repeal it in the original act and restate it in the new act so that it's quite clear what's actually being done. And for any ordinary citizen coming to read this bill, there isn't a need for him or her to open up a series of other pieces of legislation to compare and contrast and see what changes are being made and the import of those changes. We should be passing legislation that is easily accessible for every citizen and every lawyer, I must say as well, because as somebody who's sometimes had to go through a series of pieces of legislation, it can be very difficult to see exactly what the up-to-date position is in relation to the law. We can solve that problem as a legislature by essentially consolidating legislation rather than passing a number of amending acts. And this is not a bad example in terms of the Proceeds of Crime Act, but there are other pieces of legislation, I think particularly of things like the Road Traffic Acts, for example, where it's very difficult to actually understand what the latest iteration of legislation coming from these houses actually says. And so I would encourage that. That said, as I said, this is not a bad example. There is a Principal Act and other legislation referred to, but it is relatively clear for anybody who knows the situation what this bill is doing, and I do welcome what the bill is doing. As has been said by other contributors, Ireland has a history in this area of which it can be very, very proud. In the aftermath of the assassination and the murder of Veronica Guerin, action was taken by the government at that time and led by Nora Owen as Minister for Justice to put in place a very radical regime in relation to how we deal with assets that are the proceeds of crime. And as you will know, Minister, jurisdictions and colleagues throughout Europe are bending over backwards to follow Ireland in this regard and to take the lessons that we have learned in terms of how we have dealt with this. Because, again, as other contributors have said, the best way that you can hit criminal gangs, organised criminal groups, and those profiting from it is in their pockets. To take away the assets and the proceeds of crime is the very best way of having an impact on their activities and reducing the profitability and the impetus that drives that criminal activity. So the development of this law is hugely important. It's a law that must evolve with the process because, as you know, Minister, the same criminal gangs who are profiting from crime in this jurisdiction are constantly changing their methodologies, constantly changing their modus of operation to be ahead of the law, to be ahead of An Garda Síochána. And An Garda Síochána does a very effective job of keeping up with them, but we as a legislature must do that as well. So I welcome this evolution in the law, and I note the updates that are in the legislation as well. I note, for example, that it essentially streamlines the process in many respects, particularly the seizure of assets and the opportunity for the freezing of accounts to frustrate the possibility that somebody might be able to evacuate funds or get them away from the claws of the Criminal Assets Bureau or of the authorities in this jurisdiction. I think that is a reasonable measure. I would, however, sound a small note of caution in relation to how long those freezing orders can continue for without coming before a court or without being properly litigated, if I can put it that way. Sometimes, if it's an administrative process whereby an account is frozen or an asset is frozen, that freezing order can be renewed over and over again, albeit with judicial oversight, but without proper litigation, without really an opportunity for the person who is in charge of that asset or responsible for that asset or owns that asset to come before a court and actually explain why it should not be frozen. And in the circumstances where an asset is frozen on an administrative basis, there should be an opportunity for a person to come to court. More importantly than that, there should be an opportunity for them to know the basis on which the freezing order has been made. And my understanding, having dealt with people in this situation, is that isn't always available to them. And there is an inequality of arms in that regard. If you expect somebody to go into the district court or any other court to lift a freezing order, if they don't actually know the basis for the order having been made, it's very difficult for them to properly litigate that in the way that we would expect them to be able to do in the normal way. I do, however, also acknowledge that this bill will shorten the period of time that is there for the state to dispose of those assets once they have been seized, from 7 years to 2 years. I welcome that. Again, I sound a note of caution insofar as, and I haven't been able to get this out of the bill, but my understanding is that won't frustrate any appeal process and the assets won't be disposed of before the expiration of any appeal process. But that being the case, I think it's an entirely sensible measure that allows the short-circuiting of a process that has taken far too long up to now, and the notion that the state has to maintain assets for 7 years before they can be disposed of, I think is something that is blocking the benefit for the exchequer of the proceeds of crime. When they're taken away from the criminals involved, they should be able to be redistributed. And in that note, can I finish in relation to the Community Safety Fund, which I think is a hugely important initiative, relatively young relative to this legislation. But can we please focus that, and I'm not sure it's directly your responsibility, but can we please look at focusing that particularly in relation to education and literacy initiatives in disadvantaged areas. There's a programme going on in Loughlinstown in North Wicklow at the moment, which is really, really good. It's crying out for funding. And the Community Safety Fund is exactly the kind of fund that should be contributing to that, because it is something that will stem future crime.
Thank you very much. Deputy Rory O'Merkel.
Ara, I think Tomage Sásta jail all the Shaw and you. I think without doubt we're all very happy to be dealing with this piece of legislation. I would agree with whoever said it earlier on some level. We just need it to happen as quickly as possible, and possibly it should have even happened earlier. Look, we all know why the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up. We've all seen what it has done on a state basis. We've also seen even locally what it has done. And there is nobody that doesn't like to see that, you know, crime is made to pay. And whether that's through the courts or whether that is through the civil courts, as you say yourself, and that there's a financial sanction. And as I speak about sanctions, I think I would agree with what was said earlier as well. I do think that we need legislation. We definitely need to have a conversation about it in relation to dealing with those organisations, those persons, those people associated with states and companies in particularly that could be profiting or making money and involved in human rights abuses. And look, it goes without saying, we all understand what is going on today, whether we're talking about the genocide in Israel, whether we're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it cannot be okay that certain people could get away scot-free in relation to that. So no different than your street dealer, or as I say, the person that moves the funny money about. We need to ensure that there is a sanction. And as I say, we all accept that the war on drugs is lost in the traditional sense that it was understood. But while we need to have a trauma-informed and health-led policy, and we need to make sure that we look after those that are suffering from addiction, and we need to ensure that those who are young people who may fall into criminality, that we do absolutely everything in relation to diverting them. And we look at those communities and those disadvantaged communities that actually feel this the most. Because what did the Examiner say this week? It spoke about available, affordable, potent. Ireland is in a perfect storm of cocaine. Right? And we all understand that cocaine permeates every socioeconomic group, but we also know that the real harm, the drug debt intimidation, and an awful lot of it is particularly focused in working class areas and in those areas that are impacted the most. And I would say, Minister, in the limited time I have, we actually need to have a real conversation in relation to how we deal with this particular level of crime, because we all know that we need to make sure we have the family supports. We need to have the diversion pieces, whether that's youth diversion projects, whether that's the likes of Greentown or Escape Line from the operation in England in relation to trying to facilitate children who are being groomed, who are being used by criminal entities to be removed from it. But we also know that we need to see the likes of specialist health nurses, which I believe is planned, but we need to see it happen, who will actually engage with families, and we ensure that we give those supports and around those families and those wider communities that require it, because it's a matter of, we also know that in some cases we are dealing with what are the outworkings of poverty. And yes, Deputy Ward spoke about his bill that I was lucky enough to co-sponsor with him, the Proceeds of Crime Investment in Disadvantaged Communities, and that was us stating that I think we'd all agree that we needed to see that money was taken off these particular people, these people that have their heel on the neck of many of our communities, and that it is returned to organisations. But I'd also say there's never going to be enough money in that. We need to absolutely ensure that we resource everything. We resource absolutely everything, and that means in relation to those supports that are required, and also in relation to addiction services. But then beyond that, that we have what is adequate policing in relation to dealing with the bad examples. Because we know we can walk into many estates and you can point out the houses, and they have been there for a considerable length of time, of people who have been making money off the backs of their neighbours, and none of it is good enough. And at this stage, it's not just the backs of their neighbours, it's chasing after grandparents for drug debt money. We all understand this. None of it is good enough. We absolutely accept that there was a need for streamlining this. There is absolute support in relation to this, but we need to have a wider question in relation to how we deal with drug crime and how it impacts on communities.
Deputy Gary Gallant.
Let me first begin by welcoming the bill. We support it fully, but at the committee stage we do intend to press some amendments which we think could strengthen the bill. In my constituency, particularly in the area of the north inner city, and indeed a number of other constituencies in Ireland, there's a heartbreaking sight that too often many of us have grown accustomed to. Young people, children, teenagers, Kids on scramblers, kids hanging around corners with nothing to do, kids who are being used, and I mean that word very deliberately, as runners in drugs network, carrying out drop-offs, collecting debts, standing watch, kids who are still in primary school being given roles in organised crime because they're seen as less likely to be stopped, less likely to be held responsible. And that's exactly what we're dealing with here. Not the glamorised version of crime you see in tabloids or crime dramas, but the slow erosion of community by criminal networks that know exactly how to exploit poverty, how to exploit trauma, and how to exploit the absence of opportunity. And that's why the work of the Criminal Assets Bureau is so vital. When CAB seizes a house that was bought with drug money, that's not just a headline, it's a message. It's an intervention. It tells people, especially young people, that there's a limit to how long crime can pay, that there are consequences, and that there is a state watching and a state willing to act. I know that this bill, the Proceeds of Crime and Related Matters Bill 2025, will strengthen CAB's ability to act, and that is really welcome. It gives CAB faster powers to freeze accounts, whether that's in cash or in crypto. It shortens the time they have to wait before an asset can be permanently seized from 7 years down to 2. It allows courts to appoint receivers so criminal assets can't be used while the case drags on. And it closes off legal loopholes that always allows delay and stalling. It's a practical and it's a smart piece of legislation, and we support it. But seizing the assets should only be one step. The real power is what we do next. That money, those homes, that cash, those cars must be reinvested in full directly into the communities where the harm was done, where criminality has taken hold because the state failed to show up often enough or strongly enough. We should have a clear and visible pipeline. All money taken from crime goes back into youth services, into family supports, into addiction services, into education and into community policing. That's how we rebuild trust. That's how we break the cycle. I do acknowledge that funds have been allocated through the Community Safety Innovation Fund. That's very welcome, but it should be 100% of assets should be going back into communities. Because crime doesn't just destroy lives. Crime costs us a huge amount of money to the Exchequer, in Garda time, in health costs, in lost opportunities, in court backlogs, and in the price communities pay every time a child is pulled into the system. We cannot keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Seizing assets, it's absolutely part of the solution, but on its own, it's not enough, and we've seen that. We have to talk honestly about intervening directly with people already involved in drug network, not just the top brass, but the foot soldiers, the young people who are caught up in the early and often end up in prison with untreated trauma, addiction, and no exit plan. If we're serious about breaking the cycle, then we need to wrap those people in the full care of the state. That means better prison conditions, not just tougher ones. It means access to education and rehabilitation for those in prison. We need a better function for what prisons are for and what purpose they should serve. This should mean fully funded probation services, transitional housing, trauma supports, employment schemes. And it means a real investment in community-based alternatives to prison, especially for young people. Because right now, too many people go into prison with problems and come out with worse ones. That's not justice, that's a revolving door, and it's costing us in every sense of the word. I also want to make this point: we need a mini-cab approach, targeting mid-level players before they become untouchable. We all know how the certain high-level crime gangs operate now, how hard it is to dismantle that level of organisation once they're international, once their networks stretch across borders and their assets are moved offshore. But there's a level before all of that. The flashy operators in their 20s and 30s who control estates, who drive finance cars, who have 2 or 3 apartments in someone else's name, and who have built mini empires in local communities. We need to hit those assets early. We need a dedicated fast response mechanism to freeze and investigate assets at that mid-level before it becomes a full-blown cartel. Because if we wait too long, the structures become too strong, and we're already playing catch-up. But let's talk once more about the kids on the scramblers. And if they're 13 now, they're in 6th class of 4th year. If we do nothing, if all they say is the gangland lads get rich, live fast and rarely get caught, we know where they'll be at 18. But if they see assets being seized, if they see that the money is going into youth clubs that gives them purpose, if they're met by outreach workers, Garda youth diversion projects, if they're seen not just as risks, but as children worth saving, then we change the outcome and we interrupt the cycle. And we get better, safer, fairer communities, not by accident, but by design. Gaharlach, I support the bill. I believe it gives us stronger tools to disrupt organised crime. But legislation like this only works if it's matched with investment, with vision, and with a willingness to tackle inequality and exclusion head on. So let's take the money, but let's also give it back to the communities that were destroyed by the harm. Let's build a system that doesn't just punish crime, but prevents it, understands it, and replaces it with opportunity.
Deputy Martin Kenny.
Minister, the issue of crime, I suppose, is something that's feared as much as anything else across many parts of particularly rural Ireland and my own constituency. And indeed, we see today that 3 people have pleaded guilty to manslaughter for the desperate attack on Tom Nyland, an elderly man living alone in a rural area who was set upon and badly beaten and subsequently passed away. And it is the fear that that kind of situation instills in people across rural communities that is really terrifying. And it's really important that, we recognise that people in those circumstances, elderly people particularly in those kind of rural and isolated areas, and indeed in many areas in the country, who fear that they could be set upon and attacked in that way, it's a real terror for them in their lives, particularly if they live alone. And it's important that we have legislation which deals adequately with people who would carry out such attacks. And I want to commend the Gardaí in the investigation in that particular case and the outcome of it. But it still doesn't bring back the loss to the family and to the friends in that community. It's the same thing in many, many areas of the country, where we have people who are very much in the fear of crime, and yet we have to recognise that we do live in a relatively safe society, and that's important, I think, to also recognise. And it is a tiny minority of people who engage in these actions and these activities. And the issue of which you have before us today in regard to the Criminal Assets Bureau and the proceeds of crime is something which was a game changer when it came to dismantling many of these criminal gangs that carry out such activities, and particularly I think the whole drugs industry and the work around that is something that also there has to be commended for the work that has been done by the states and the agencies of the state, and not just the Gardaí but others as well. I think it's also important to recognise that even in the communities which, many of the communities in inner city Dublin, where there are serious problems with high levels of criminality and high levels of drug addiction and all of that, it is a small minority of people that are involved in it. In these communities it is 80, 90, 95% of people are decent, hard-working, ordinary people who want to get on with their lives and want to build and live in a decent society. And yet this small minority of people continue to erode and cause huge difficulties in respect of that. And I know that there was a report done a couple of years ago now, I think, by, was it Johnny Connolly, I think, done a report into that and done a very, very good assessment of the situation. And one of the things that came out of it was that there had to be something done to ensure that younger people were not attracted to the lifestyle which was being on show by these criminals who go out in a very bashful way about how they live their lives. So I think being able to attack their assets and being able to take them down is very, very important. And the Criminal Assets Bureau has done great work and could do much more. And I think one of the things that they could do much more in is going after the people who are at a slightly lower level in that food chain, and ensuring that there is a mechanism there to attack them and their lifestyle, so that it just doesn't become something which is attractive to younger people. In many communities, unfortunately, very young children are being used by some of these criminal gangs, particularly for running drugs and all of that sort of thing. And it's not just in inner city areas, it's in every town in the country. And if you like, the habit of criminality that comes in at a young age takes a long time to break. And if these children end up in prison as youngsters and they go on then to a life not just of crime, but a life which has no future, and no future for them and no future for their communities, I think that needs to be, the motivation that all of us have to ensure that we have adequate legislation in place to deal with it. This legislation is something which I clearly support and understand why it has to be done. I think there can be more done in this whole area, and I think we also need to do more to build the resistance and the capacity of these communities to deal with this. And to do that, I think we need to have more resources in place. There needs to be a greater emphasis on having youth facilities in place, on having addiction facilities in place, and all of those things. So I think it's very, very important to recognise that this legislation doesn't stand alone. It needs much more support around it.
I welcome the Proceeds of Crime and Related Matters Bill, which as the Minister had said, is a major upgrade to existing related legislation. I welcome the fact that it will reduce from 7 years to 2 years the time between a judicial determination of an asset being the proceeds of crime and indeed a final disposal order being available, but especially the immediate and automatic appointment of a receiver in respect of those assets to ensure that respondents can continue to benefit pending that final disposal order being made, subject to the normal caveats against a risk of injustice. And I will continue in that vein in a while in relation to the receiver. But first, I also want to welcome how the bill strengthens the CAB's investigative powers, including the freezing of bank accounts. And obviously, as others have stated, I support the strengthening of the local community safety fund. And I do note that it's a budget of £4 million in 2025, so it's going up. But I definitely think there is scope, given the overall CAB budget, to massively increase the community element. I personally believe that all money should be ring-fenced to ensure that it services those communities that most need it. Communities often decimated by drugs, drug dealing, and of course related intimidation. Communities that are identified as being in need by the Pobal HB Deprivation Index. And of course, any monies also raised should go towards the local youth diversion projects and meaningful community projects. But I would say, and Minister, maybe you can clarify in your final contribution, that in relation to a property seized by CAB, and I'm talking about a property, the government and the agency should look at putting this asset into use as quickly as possible. And I think the immediate and automatic appointment of a receiver provides some leeway here. I'd envisage a situation, for example, whereby a 4-bed house, after a 2-year period and following any appeals, could be transferred immediately to a family on a local authority housing list or to an approved housing body. But even before that, someone who's near or on top of the list, who's in receipt of HAP, for example, could be allowed live at the property while the final adjudication is being made, with any rental income going to the receiver. And of course, in the case of a successful appeal going back to the individuals concerned, that revenue would go back to them. But more likely, as we've seen, it would go into the CAB coffers for distribution to a good cause. So if there is any legal mechanism for that, Minister, I would certainly welcome that. I want to reiterate what some of my colleagues have said about the idea of a mini CAB to go after the smaller people and raise some funds, and definitely some more kind of consequences that would be able to seize things like scooters for antisocial behaviour. It's not directly related, but I think we should look at that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Paul Lawless.
Can firstly, I want to welcome this bill, and I want to commend the great work of the members of An Garda Síochána and indeed the members working in the Criminal Assets Bureau. And it is really, really important that we tackle criminals at source. And the best way to do this is, of course, tackling the proceeds from crime. We very much welcome the fact that the turnaround time will be reduced from 7 years to 2 years, Minister. Indeed, it is something that we in Aontú have called for quite some time. And I would also like to ask the Minister to please ensure that we try to use this money to obviously reinvest it back into the communities, but also invest it back in terms of An Garda Síochána themselves. They are really struggling in Mayo, Minister. I spoke to a guard recently, Minister, in Castlebar station, who told me when members of An Garda Síochána are attending court, when members are out sick, the station on some occasions cannot function. And in the past 3 years, my own constituency of Mayo, Minister, has received just one new Garda recruit. And I spoke to the Garda Commissioner last year, and he told me that there are more D19 transfer requests in from the Garda Síochána. These are people, young people in the main from Mayo, from Roscommon, from Galway, working in Dublin, who are seeking to relocate back to Mayo. And they can't relocate back to Mayo, Minister. And the Commissioner told me because they just don't have the manpower in Dublin. And I actually believe that the Dublin is being prioritised in that sense, while Mayo is being left, and Mayo and the counties along the West, Minister, in relation to this. And I think it's really, really important that we address the issues in An Garda Síochána and tackle the problems around morale, around the bureaucratic practices in the force. And indeed, Minister, I would like to raise with you as well, the new geographical units are not working. The regions are far too large, and it is causing a massive deterioration in terms of proactive policing that this country has been built on since the foundation of the state. So I also want to say that Deputy Taveen has long argued, and indeed aimed to, that money should be recouped and ring-fenced for An Garda Síochána. And I think, Minister, it's really important that you tackle the issues in the force, because there are major reasons. And Minister, the Garda force used to be a job, an intergenerational job, a job where one's father would pass it on to his son. Indeed, there has been 3 generations in the Garda force. And the link is now broken. And it has been broken before your time, Minister, but I think you have a significant job of work in terms of addressing this, because the truth is, fathers are no longer passing the baton on to their sons. In fact, they're telling them to get out. And I know guards, Minister, that have seeking to relocate back to Mayo. And because that request cannot be facilitated, they're actually leaving the force because they cannot afford to live in Dublin. They're young people that are happy to continue to be guards, but not happy to continue to work in the capital, and therefore they're willing to go back, work on the farm, work in pubs, work in shops, and leave the guards as a result. And I do believe, Minister, that you need to work on this. There are hundreds of applications in D19 requests that cannot be facilitated, and it is no fault of their own. In fact, it is the fault of government. It is the fault of your predecessors, Minister, that have reduced the guards in terms of the difficulties they're facing in terms of the bureaucratic practices, the lack of proactive policing that is now happening. And guards are telling me, Minister, that the force, the guards used to be a job where, you were out in the street, you were tackling criminals. And more often than not now, it's a job where you're tied up behind screens, tied up in knots, because of the level of accountability now in the job. And it is true, Minister, because I was out recently in a bank holiday weekend, one of the busiest weekends of the year, and there was no guards to be seen on the street. And that is reflective of where we are at the moment. So, Minister, I would ask you to ensure that the issues in the force are addressed and the money is used to tackle and support the Gardaí. Thank you.
Deputy Michael Collins. Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. And the proceeds and the briefing paper here today, I was looking at it, which we would agree, and most people inside here are agreeing, is reduced time frame from 7 to 2 years for disposal of assets identified as proceeds of crime, strengthens criminal assets bureaus, powers to restrain and seize assets before the High Court process, introduces new restraint orders to prevent transactions linked to suspected proceeds of crime, automatic appointment to receiver to deprive individuals benefits from criminal assets, and all these things we certainly will be agreeing with Minister. But I'd like to think that we should focus going forward on nipping the crime, nipping it at the bud. And that's where we're failing to do so in this country at this present time. And I hate to agree with the Deputy that in a statement he made a while ago, but you have to agree because it's common sense that we've lost the law on drugs. He said the law on drugs is lost, and that's just a sad statement to make, but it's a factual statement that the Deputy has made. And I don't think I think years of lack of resources on Garda Síochána has left us in that situation, neglect as such. And I noticed myself in West Cork, the drugs unit in Bantry is now closed because, and I praised the issue, because of the lack of Gardaí in West Cork. So yes, there is abandoned drugs unit, but mother of God, a huge coastline along the Mizzen Head is, and Sheep's Head and the Beara is now going, I suppose, I won't say unmanned because there's been serious apprehension of drugs in the last couple of years, even recently, by the guards in West Cork. I'd like to absolutely commend Chief Superintendent Vincent O'Sullivan and so many of his guards. But there's only so much you can work with. And if the numbers are down, the numbers are facts, and the facts are there, Minister, the numbers of Gardaí in West Cork are down. And I really would appreciate you might send me on those numbers so that I can prove to you that they're down. And how are you going to turn that around? Because crime, especially when it comes to drugs, is brought in mainly by sea. And I'm surrounded by sea. My constituency, the nearest parish west of me is New York. I live in the Mizzen Head. So, as I say, you head down into Barry Row, you head down into Timothy, you're all surrounded by sea below that, like, and sail the whole thing at sea. So that's the areas you need to be spending your resources on. That's where the drugs are coming in, and these guys are walking away free, unless the Gardaí are majorly on top of their game, and they can't be when they're under-resourced. And that's an area you need to look at. We need to keep looking at how we nip in the crime along that line. And an issue I brought up last week, which is a very important issue to the towns and the villages of West Cork, in Skibbereen, Clonakilty and Dunmanway. I'm waiting 8 days from you, Minister, your department, for an answer as to why was CCTV turned off in those towns. Surely be to God, you could give me a fair and honest answer in a couple of days and at least see where we're going with this. Now we've raised it, Councillor Daniel Sexton has raised it inside in the council level, and the council are not giving us an answer other than they're going to try and meet you this week, the department, and try and see where they can go. Why is CCTV being turned off? Is it being turned off throughout the rest of Ireland? It's leaving communities wide open. The local communities fundraise for that. The community alerts, the business watches, to make sure they had that little bit of extra security so that there was these lunatics peddling drugs out there. They're being seen on CCTV. They know they're being watched. There's somebody watching them, because the local people in the Gardaí can't do everything. And then automatically, bang, 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 switches go down last Tuesday in West Cork. So West Cork is blacked out last Tuesday in relation to CCTV. And you, Minister, your department cannot answer me in 8 days as to why that has happened, and is there any hope of turning this around, or how quickly it can be turned around for the safety of the people. I'm being honest and fair. I wrote to you twice. Answer me the question, a fair and honest answer, and let's sit down around the table to the bodies that be to try and see can we resolve this. And I don't know, is there others? I'm told Kinsale, Bantry and Scull is still switched on. But the fact is there others throughout the country that's in the same situation? Is there more? And is this the way it's gone? Is CCTV going to be switched off in our country, which is going to make our communities extremely vulnerable to crime and wide open crime? Why did the community alerts meet around the table with the local Garda Síochána in the first place and put it there? For to keep their communities safe. And why are they switched off today? And that answer needs to come, and I need that answer immediately. The Dáil shouldn't be sitting this evening and we get straight answers. I don't care if it's this evening or tomorrow morning, I want it, or Saturday or Sunday morning. I want an answer for those people, Minister. And I keep asking for it, and I'm not getting it from you. And it has to come from you, unfortunately, because it looks like you, not personally, but your department. And I plead with you once again to look into that. And it's a huge issue as far as I'm concerned in West Cork, so that we can at least keep it safe. And talking about, young people, and I see initiatives that we need to encourage more and more and more from the department, or from wherever it's coming from, in relation to Gardaí. And I see one initiative in West Cork that has worked so well, is the Garda Youth Awards. And they're trying to, pat young people on the back, give them a purpose, let them know they've done some good, let them know that they're there, and that things can be changed. And I really come in, like the Garda, Damien White and Bridget Hartnett, and Garda Jonathan McCarthy, and Garda Ian O'Callaghan and Don Davis and others who have put together that Garda Youth Award. And Chloe O'Callaghan from my own area won it this year, and others have won it other years. But and from other communities of Bantry and different places. And it's a great way to give young people a boost, because everybody points the fingers. You people are involved in this and involved in that. They're not. So Chloe Ann is involved. She's a great athlete from my area, and involved in other community initiatives. And she got, you know, a little bit of honour for that, and it gives her a boost, and it gives others a boost to meet that same standard as such going forward. And we do have to look at the protection of Gardaí also, Minister, and this is a very serious issue. And I was talking to, you know, Gardaí, like, you know, they have an area of non-disclosure in their community, and they don't want to be whistleblowers, but they are concerned. And they're out on the roads trying to prevent, you know, especially drugs coming into communities. And I know that, you know, one area where there's one Jeep and one BMW from Cork City all the way down to Castletownbere. And them guards have told me that when they stand on the side of the road, they have little or no coloured clothing. Very, very little. Now, in comparison to the ambulance service, they're completely well clothed and well covered. Their vehicles are not covered, and they feel unsafe on the side of the road. Remember, these are people that have young families. They're not making up the story, Minister. I wouldn't be coming in making up a story like that. That's a serious issue, especially with recent issues. But I think that prompted their call that they need to have further and proper protective gear going forward, and especially coloured gear in relation to their safety on the side of the road, because they are keeping us safe in the long term. That's what they're saying to me. The vehicle isn't properly illuminated. They're not properly illuminated in comparison, we'll say, to an ambulance service where there's complete and other illuminated clothing. So that's an area that they would like for you, Minister, to look into. And I look into areas. This is good. This is all good reading, in fairness, and tightens rules to prevent re-litigation over whether assets or proceeds of crime, broadens CAB powers for data sharing domestically and internationally, extends CAB staff anonymity provisions, reflects evolving EU asset confiscation standards, but does not fully address international enforcement's approach to crime prevention and deterrence. The bill focuses specifically on targeting the financial assets of criminals. Independent Ireland's focus on stricter sentences, eliminating suspended sentences for serious crimes, and supporting Gardaí retention. And Independent Ireland did come out very clear in relation to this, that we need stricter sentences. I often look at sentences and I kind of scratch my head sometimes, because I see some very, very serious crimes, and I see very light sentences, and then you see someone has stole something, which is not a good thing to do, and they must be apprehended, but might have given back the money and still get a jail sentence, you know, and you'd wonder, could there be a little bit of a better balance going forward, because we certainly see a lot of heavy crime being walked around. And I listened to some parties here today, and they kind of came in saying they support this and they're concerned in their communities in relation. I'm just going to pick from one party, and I'm looking at their statements, their mission statements. Social Democrats believe that, in line with international best practice, a policy of decriminalisation should be pursued in respect to possession of drugs for personal consumption. I personally don't agree with that, because if you're going to accept it in the back door, you may as well accept it in the front door. So that's a crazy system. You can't come in here afterwards and say that the country has gone mad in relation to drugs crime, if you're turning around and saying, yeah, sure, look, it is all right in a small way, it's fine. It's not. Drugs is drugs, and that's the bottom line. The only time I ever stood up here for any type of drugs was medicinal cannabis for a child that was very, very ill. That type of system, that setup is totally and utterly different. So, look, Minister, I would appreciate you would look into the areas, especially CCTV is a huge issue, looking to see how you can further support Gardaí Youth Awards, how we can further support our Gardaí, whether it's in West Cork or was in Galway, wherever it is, that there is more Gardaí in the street and more Gardaí on the beat. And I just pick out one Garda in West Cork, Jonathan McCarthy, and he lives in the area. He nips bud on the crime. He knows where it's going wrong before it goes wrong himself. And I've seen young people going wrong, and I've seen him put them right, because he's living in Balladab. And that's difficult, because the local people go down to the door and knock on the door, come on, we need you up the road now. And that's not fair, and that's difficult for the guard, but it's the great type of guard you got out there. They really know how to help community make sure things get sorted, and usually it irons itself out. And they're the type of guards we need to be coming in. They're the type of guards we need to be promoting in our communities, and more of them. And we don't have that many of them. They're not there because they're not adequately resourced, and the local Gardaí are not adequately resourced. And I'd appreciate you working that going forward, Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Gillian Toole. Mahagat Ceann Comhairle agus an Ara. I think I'll be very careful if I go to West Cork on my holidays. Thank you for the heads up. Anyway, on a more serious note, to thank you, Minister, all members of your team, and I presume the Office of the Parliamentary Legal Affairs as well, for the sterling work on what I would consider to be very future-proofing and highly considerate and safeguarding of the next generations of this country. I would also like to pay particular gratitude to our juvenile liaison officers. I will name two in particular in County Meath, Gardaí Barbara Kelly and Aisling Connor, and the entire community team there, the support workers of the youth diversion projects, the community and voluntary leaders of the drug and alcohol task forces, the members of the Strengthening Families programmes, and all of the volunteers who participate in night leagues, who help with community buses. This is fantastic work, and it sets, I suppose, the tone. I'm not going to tell you what to do next or otherwise. I think this in itself is fantastic, and it opens the door to other far-reaching work. The Community Safety Fund, I think, is pivotal, and the growth from 2 million to 4 million is absolutely welcomed. I think how that money is used and the allocation of it within the communities and the use of data to target specifically areas where it will be most beneficial and will be most far-reaching and enable children to reach their full potential, whilst limiting the very individuals that suck the lifeblood out of communities and out of families. Two areas in particular, I'm not going to repeat everything that my colleagues have said. I see you taking plenty of notes. You don't need any more to add to your list. There are two areas in particular that I'd just like to mention when funds are being distributed. Absolutely further investment in the fiscal and human resources of An Garda Síochána, but also the necessary investment in drug and alcohol and mental health supports in collaboration with the health service executive. And also the education and training boards, particularly those that provide tutors to the local training initiatives and the special community employment schemes. I will refer to two in particular in County Meath, Meath Opportunities for Training, the local training initiative. It's linked up with Tabor House, which supports people in recovery from drugs and alcohol. And then there's the special community employment scheme in Navan, which assists people regaining life skills and upskilling. And as we know from other debates in the House, there are funding gaps for tutors who provide that invaluable service. So I don't think there'll be any shortage of extremely deserving community-based organisations that will help people to recover and will also help safeguard young people and deliver them from life-limiting and life-damaging interactions with the drugs trade in particular. But I absolutely, again, I applaud, commend, and I thank you for your work thus far. Gaurav Mahagat.
Thank you, Deputy Toole. And that concludes the speakers. Minister O'Callaghan.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. I want to thank all my colleagues for their contributions. I think it is also notable and unusual that everyone who has spoken is very much in favour of the legislation. There's full support across the House. I welcome that. I also think it's important that when it comes to people who are involved in criminality and generating wealth from criminality, that they know that there's unanimity in this House in our opposition to them and in our desire to combat them. I'll just deal with some of the issues that were raised by colleagues. Deputy Mark Ward spoke about white-collar crime. It is the case that CAB does go after white-collar crime. It's not simply the case that they only go after people involved in drug dealing or activities such as that. Deputy Ward also spoke about the Community Safety Fund, as did very many other colleagues. Obviously, there's a desire for the money to go back into the areas that are most affected by it. There is an application process. Like, it may be the case that some communities are better informed when it comes to filling out application forms. That could be a legitimate comment in respect to the matter. If that is so, like, I think those communities need to be informed about the fund, and people in this House and elsewhere will be happy to assist in terms of filling out the application forms. Deputy Ward also asked about a mini CAB. In fairness to CAB, they go after people in terms of assets, even if there's low amounts, in the low thousands, in respect of assets which are the proceeds of crime. So they don't have a hierarchy that says they only go after the sort of the millionaire criminals. They do target the lifestyle of rich criminals. There's a lot of observation work that goes on by CAB. They're looking at people's lifestyles, and there's a lot of work going on under the surface that we don't hear about and that we don't discuss in this House. And just finally, Deputy Ward spoke about youth diversions. Obviously, we need to ensure we have as many youth diversion programmes operating as possible. And later this year, I hope to be in a situation where every area will have a functioning youth diversion programme powered by the probation service. Deputy Quinn Liven referred to the feuds in Limerick. It's worth noting, however, there were significant feuds in Limerick before, and the Gardaí got on top of them. They dealt with them, and CAB played a significant role in that as well. Regrettably, it's probably always the case when one crime gang has got rid of, someone else is going to rise up and take their place. But the important thing is that the Gardaí will be on their case and that CAB will be following them closely after that. The message should go out that it is a pointless activity getting involved in crime. You may generate money in the short term, but ultimately in the long term it's going to result in imprisonment and your assets being seized and a very negative reflection on your life. Deputy Kelly made some comments about the role of Rory Quinn in the proceeds of crime legislation. I'm beginning to see now that success has many fathers. I mentioned John O'Donoghue, Barry Ward mentioned Nora Owen, and Deputy Kelly mentioned Rory Quinn. Listen, I just want to commend the government and members of the Oireachtas back in 1996 who came up with this innovative idea. Deputy Kelly also spoke about Deputy Howland's bill from a number of years ago, which was the Proceeds of Crime Gross Human Rights Abuses Act. I haven't had an opportunity to look at that. I would have thought it would be fairly difficult to try to transpose a provision like that into Irish law. My understanding from listening to Deputy Kelly was that there was legislation that would permit the Criminal Assets Bureau to seize assets belonging to different countries that are present in this jurisdiction if those countries were involved in abuse of human rights. The legislation dealing with seizing assets from criminals in this country is difficult enough, as we can see from the complexity of it. I'm not in a position to start going around seizing assets in respect of human rights abuses around the world. However, I do look forward to seeing the amendment that Deputy Kelly said he'd bring forward in respect of it. And to use civil service speak, I'd say that's a very challenging amendment, but we look at it in due course. I want to thank Deputy Devlin for his contribution in respect of it. I suppose one of the things I thought about when I was listening to Deputy Devlin is the fact that yesterday or earlier this week there was the decision of the Supreme Court in terms of route back, and that was a situation where the Supreme Court overturned the decision of the Court of Appeal that refused to allow new evidence to be heard in respect of a proceeds of crime application. The reason, I think, from a brief perusal of it, was that the Supreme Court said there was new evidence. I think it is we are entitled statutorily to change the rules as we are doing here to say that that matter can't be opened up again. Deputy Barry Ward mentioned that we need a consolidated version of bills which come before the House. Can I just say it's difficult enough in terms of getting preparation to do a bill without coming forward with the consolidated version of a very large piece of legislation. If you're looking for that, however, the Law Reform Commission frequently publish consolidated, updated versions of legislation. If you look at the Proceeds of Crime Act on the Law Reform Commission's website, you'll see that it includes all the most recent amendments, and if these are enacted into law, these amendments will be included in it as well. Deputy Ward also said that we have to exercise caution when it comes to freezing orders. Certainly when you look at the legislation, there's fair procedures built into it completely, and I think it has withstood constitutional challenge by various persons. And a lot of this legislation has been tested in the Supreme Court shortly after its enactment in 1996, and it has been found to be constitutional. I note that Deputy O'Murku again echoed the point that was made by Deputy Kelly about trying to use it for the purpose of human rights abuses. I think the best way to deal with issues like that is the sanctions that are imposed at an EU level. That's how we're dealing with sanctions and freezings of assets belonging to certain persons, say from Russia. It's got agreement at EU level. It can only be done when there's agreement at EU level. He also mentioned the issue in respect of cocaine, which regrettably is prevalent throughout our society. Deputy Gannon also welcomed the bill. You referred to it as being a smart piece of legislation. And he spoke about addiction. Like, addiction is the real consequence of this type of criminal activity. People delivering drugs, dealing in drugs. It has a really disastrous consequences for young people who get caught up in addiction. I regret to say, however, that no part of the country is immune from that addiction, and every constituency of every TD in this House has addiction issues. I've seen that myself in terms of visiting addiction services. Deputy Gannon also spoke about having a mini cab. Again, I'll just repeat the point I made in response to Deputy Mark Ward, that they do go after small amounts of assets if they believe that the proceeds are crime. Deputy Kenny mentioned about how crime in Ireland is feared. People fear it. That is true, but I think we need to be balanced in our understanding of it as well. Ireland is, relatively to other countries, a safe country. There is going to be crime in a country where you have a successful economy and when there's money available. Regrettably, people are going to fall for the attraction of drugs, although they should not do so. In terms of the proceeds of crime applications before the courts, there are very many of them. It's not simply the case that just a small number of applications. I had a look at the legal diary just as I was listening to colleagues here, and today there was a proceeds of crime list in the High Court, 22 items listed in it. So there's a lot of work going on in respect to the Criminal Assets Bureau. Deputy Gogarty welcomed the bill, and he asked whether or not the properties that are frozen, whether they could be rented out. In practical terms, what happens is when a Section 3 freezing order is made, the property is sold, and then the money is collected by the receiver, and the money becomes the issue in dispute. So it's the practice of CAB, after freezing an asset, to sell it, to liquidate it, if we can use that expression, and to get the money, and then there's a dispute about who's entitled to the money, and that's the dispute which is determined by the courts. Deputy Lawless said that Gardaí and Mayo are struggling. It's not my experience of Gardaí and Mayo. When I was down there doing the Colm Horkin run a couple of weeks ago, I saw a great sense of community spirit from the Gardaí there in Charlestown. I think that operates throughout Mayo. He mentioned the point, as did Deputy Collins, about the fact they want to see more Gardaí in the streets. The biggest problem I face as a Minister for Justice, everywhere I go, people say we want to see more Gardaí. I'm limited in the numbers I have. It's my job to try to recruit more. But what I can't do is start going around saying I'll give a couple of Gardaí to certain constituencies. I don't get involved in that. That's a matter for the Commissioner. I think it would be inappropriate if a Minister for Justice started going around directing where they should go. And just finally, Deputy Collins spoke about how we've lost the war on drugs. I disagree with that. Like, let's look at it. What's the alternative? Is we just put up our hands and say, let's legalise drugs, let them come in. The addiction levels will increase significantly. We've seen experiments in other parts of the world, America, Canada, where they've legalised drugs. It's been a disaster for them. Psychotic episodes for young people have shot through the roof. Addiction levels have gone up. It's become a bigger problem, so you're better off having it criminalised. In terms of CCTV, for Deputy Collins, I don't have an answer, but local authorities really are responsible for the operation of them. Thanks, Ken Corla.